computer. You should have just heard something that said recording in progress. So we can start.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Parkway Speaker Series presentation. Today and also next Sunday, November 21st, our subject will be critical race theory, truth and myth. Our guest and lecturer on critical race theory is David Spener, longtime professor of sociology and anthropology at Trinity University, which is located in San Antonio, Texas. By way of his academic background, David received his MS in applied linguistics at Georgetown University in 1985, and then his doctorate in sociology from the University of Texas at Austin. He then joined the Trinity faculty in 1997. He has also worked as an adjunct professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin. Trinity University is a private institution that was founded way back in 1869. And according to the 2022 edition of Best Colleges, is ranked #1 in the category of regional universities in the West. And our favorite question for those of us who live in St. Louis, yes, David was raised in Brentwood and graduated from Brentwood High School. Interestingly, he and his spouse still own the family cabin deep in the Ozarks, where they both go to retreat, restore, and research. I've known David since he was born. If you hear him during his presentation call me Uncle Dick, that's because I am, proudly so. Among other courses, David teaches subjects about race and ethnic relationships at Trinity. He also teaches elements of critical race theory because those are crucial to his research and teaching. He teaches CRT as I would submit any educator is required to do so, with sincerity and impartiality. And I think that's very important for our discussion today and our discussions as you go forth out in the community to recognize that it seems to me anyway that critical race theory has become the right wing's new demon. But yet, if you challenge that, they sometimes have a difficulty with defining exactly what CRT is. So let's get started. Professor Spener, welcome. And thank you for being with us today. Please rescue us, if you will, from all the mischief and misleading nonsense out there about CRT.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the invitation.
To review the basics, and I think you have some PowerPoints to share with us.
Yeah, I have a few slides to just sort of put out some basic information that I think may be helpful, and then give us some things to discuss and to guide our discussion after this initial introduction. So let me go ahead and I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully our technology will be working. And I'm going to make this full screen so you get a good view of it. Let's see if that works. Okay. And I'm going to reduce my staring at myself. You may still see me in one corner of the presentation. I'm not sure what it looks like to you. But I thought I'd start out with a couple of things from Martin Luther King. First of all, I would ask, did you know that Martin Luther King majored in sociology at Morehouse College before going to seminary and becoming a reverend? Some of us are very proud of the fact that he was a sociology student. And here, I'm just sharing with you a quote from his letter from Birmingham Jail, because I'm assuming that as a congregation of the United Church of Christ, that most of the people in the audience are going to be people who are pretty moderate. And it's really the moderates in many ways that have to define themselves in the debates and discussions and struggles over matters of racial justice and injustice. And so he said in his letter, first, I have to confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice. And I think that this quote is relevant insofar as critical race theory has its origins in the study of law and the critical study of law. I also thought, since it's a religious congregation that I am speaking with, that I would share with you my favorite passage of Letter from Birmingham Jail, which, although I am not an especially religious person, I find very powerful. And this is a passage that most people don't go to when they talk about Letter from Birmingham Jail and its importance. But I would argue that this passage is perhaps not necessarily the most important, but one of the most fundamental to understanding King's thinking at that time in 1963. And he said in this passage, all segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, substitutes an I-it relationship for an I-thou relationship, and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. Hence, segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, it is morally wrong and sinful. Paul Tillich, a well-known Protestant theologian, has said that sin is separation. Is not segregation an existential expression of man's, he said, we could say human beings, tragic separation, our awful estrangement, our terrible sinfulness? And this is really Martin Luther King, although he doesn't use the term, referring to a process that we sociologists call othering, right? One of the universal things about human beings is that we create in-groups and out-groups on all kinds of arbitrary bases. But the fundamental thing to understand here is that we, as human beings, recognize members of our in-groups as being worthy of being recognized as members of our community and as being highly individuated. We recognize all of their unique individual humanity, right? And we treat one another according to certain rules, right? But people in our out-groups, we see as not being like us, as not being as individuated as the members of our own community, and also as not necessarily deserving of the same kind of treatment as we would give to members of our in-groups in our community. And when this is carried to an extreme, really ugly things have happened historically, right? You start treating other people as things, and we all know that as human beings, we are allowed to treat inanimate objects or not fully human beings in a different way than we treat fellow human beings. This is also relevant because racism is kind of a unique creation, really, of Western civilization. Western civilization in the age of the Enlightenment comes to need racism. Why? Precisely because we have developed during the Enlightenment period all of these ideas about individual rights and reason, right? And the need for people to be able to make choices and to actively pursue the truth in an open and free kind of a way. The problem becomes that in systems that require exploitation of one kind or another, of some by others, in order to generate wealth, right? You have to have some reason for justifying the exploitation and maltreatment of others, right? Because you also have these ideas about freedom and about the integrity of the individual human being that can't be violated. And so what ends up happening in the West, according to the historian George Fredrickson in his brief history of racism, is that racism becomes the way that the ideas about human rights, et cetera, can be violated because some human beings are not seen as being deserving of fully human treatment because they are so radically different. They are so other than the group that is mistreating them, okay? Another thing that we need to think about with regard to critical race theory, and we'll get to this more in a moment, is that it is quite true that human physical variation exists, right? That we see with our own eyes all the time, okay? But this variation in human physical appearance doesn't map very neatly onto racial categories, which are very unstable over the course of history and from one culture and society to the next. So we say that these racial categories are socially constructed. They're not biologically or genetically determined. And I'll just give you a quick example of that. If you think about the term Asian American as a racial category in the US Census, it includes people that physically speaking look vastly different from one another. People from South Asia, India, Bangladesh, West Asia, Afghanistan, Iran, et cetera, along with people from Japan, China, Vietnam, Thailand, et cetera. And if you think about how people tend to look that are from those different parts of the world, they don't look much like one another. In fact, culturally don't have necessarily a whole lot in common with one another either. And yet they're considered to be members of the same race in the United States. And Kevin and Uncle, don't hesitate to interrupt if you have a question or you'd like a clarification as I go along here. I thought it would be good to just,
David,
yes,
that in this congregation, so we're an open and affirming congregation, which means that we do everything we can not to other people. We taking down walls and making sure that people just don't feel welcome, but that they are affirmed,
right,
and that people can play any role that we have and are welcome to receive the sacraments. And the main goal is to belong to each other. So to tell our stories, to listen to each other, to learn together, to laugh together, to lament together, and to really figure out how do we live this belonging with each other. So it really aligns with what you're saying.
Yeah, well, good. I'm glad to hear that. I'm not surprised given the history of the United Church of Christ. My understanding is that this denomination was one of the leading abolitionist denominations back in the day. And I think that view of being a welcoming sacred community is a very important one. And I'm glad to hear that that's how you're trying to comport yourselves as a religious community. I wanted to introduce some just sort of really basic terms because they're analytically different, but they get sort of thrown around as if they meant the same thing in common everyday conversation. So one thing that has to do with race is prejudice, right? In other words, it's ill will that people may have towards members of another race. Prejudice meaning you're prejudging them based on their membership in a racial category. That's to be distinguished, that's an attitude, right? That's an emotional, intellectual response, right? That an individual or group of individuals might have. Discrimination, on the other hand, requires that people have either the individual power or institutional power in order to act on that prejudice, in order to be able to deny opportunities to the people against whom prejudice is felt or towards whom prejudice is felt, right? And in order to discriminate, you have to be able to discriminate. You have to be an employer, for example, who can decide who to hire and who to fire, who to promote, who to relegate to an inferior position, etc. If you're an institution, you get to decide who gets to be part of that institution or not. and how an individual or a group of individuals will be assigned to different roles in that institution, right? So discrimination requires power. It's an act, whereas prejudice is more of a feeling. The other things that we have to distinguish between, and Uncle, you're going to like this because it comes from the law, is the difference between de jure discrimination or de jure racism, meaning legally sanctioned, and de facto, something that exists empirically but may be illegal, okay? And so critical race theory emerges in a period following the civil rights reforms in the mid-60s in the United States as a reaction to the persistence of de facto racial discrimination and inequality in spite of the de jure outlawing it in the 1960s with the civil rights reforms that were signed into law, mainly under the Johnson administration. And yes.
Do you have an example of something that is de facto racial discrimination?
Well, I will talk in a few minutes. I want to give the example of what goes on in the housing market and its implication for wealth accumulation. It has to do with state policies in the past and in the present that don't violate any laws today, but that still produce disparate results in racial terms. So if I can hold off on that a little bit. But I did want to mention, I went to a talk the other day by the journalist and presidential historian John Meacham, who you may see on TV a lot. He's written books about the friendship between Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. He wrote a biography of Andrew Jackson. He's often, I think, on CNN and those sorts of things. And he asked a rhetorical question in this talk. He said, well, when did the first free presidential election in the United States happen? And he said, actually, 1968. That was the first election in which Richard Nixon was elected that really, legally at least, involved the operation of a multiracial democracy. And all three of us, I think, were alive at that time. And it's hard to think about this country as having its first free presidential election, not until 1968, when it was founded in 1776 and has a constitution that dates from 1789. And that's just a little thing for us to think about. That's not to say that there aren't still problems with how we operate as a democracy, but it gave me pause when he said that. Now, I want to share with you some basic concepts that don't really come from critical race theory, but I think help us understand critical race theory a little bit better. And that is that racism always, always, always involves violence of some kind. And I want to refer to the ideas and the concepts, the conceptual framework of a Norwegian sociologist now in his 90s named Johan Galtung. And he talks about violence as being present whenever human beings are being influenced so that their actual somatic and mental realizations are below their potential realizations. In other words, violence is present when people are not allowed to fulfill their human potential either physically or mentally or both, right? They're prevented somehow from being fully human. And then he goes on to say that there are three different distinct types of violence. The one that we're most familiar with is where there's an actor that commits the violence, and he calls that personal or direct violence, right? Dick punches Spot the dog. That's direct violence, or kicks Spot the dog, right? There's an identifiable perpetrator and an identifiable victim or set of victims, okay? But he goes on to say there may not be any person who directly harms another person in the structure of society. Violence can be built into the structure of society and shows up as unequal power and consequently as unequal life chances. And let's be clear, he's not talking specifically about the United States here, and he's not talking specifically about race. And he says, in order not to overwork the word violence, we shall sometimes refer to the concept of structural violence as social injustice, right? So it's not that you're actively seeing one specific identifiable individual actor or set of actors committing an obvious physical act against another individual victim or set of victims, but rather there's something about the way a society is organized that produces unequal outcomes, unequal life chances, unequal abilities to fulfill our human potential physically and mentally. And he goes on to argue that all cases of structural violence can, by closer scrutiny, be traced back to direct violence in their prehistory. And so he says that also that direct violence may, when necessary, enforce structural violence in the final instance, okay? So that's something to be thinking about. And if we go back to earlier points in our history, we certainly can see acts of direct violence helping to create the conditions for structural violence, slavery being one of the major examples, but also the creation of a free market system of private property through the seizure of communal lands held by native populations on this continent who numbered in the millions. This was not an empty territory that European settlers came across and then created a society on their own. It involved the displacement and the dispossession of people who were already here. And then he also talks about a form of violence called cultural violence. And he says, by cultural violence, we mean those aspects of culture, the symbolic sphere of our existence, that are exemplified by religion and ideology, language and art, empirical science and formal science, that can be used to justify or legitimize either direct or structural violence, right? In other words, ways of thinking about the world that make the other kinds of violence, if not entirely okay, at least acceptable under many circumstances, okay? And cultural violence rather has to do a lot with attitudes and beliefs that we are socialized into accepting and into believing, often unconsciously, okay? And I want to just ask you, Kevin and Uncle Dick, if you remember what it was that ended Joe Biden's presidential campaign in 2008. Do you remember?
He must have said something that was controversial.
It was definitely controversial, and it ended his candidacy almost immediately. Somebody, do you remember, Kevin?
No.
Well, somebody asked him, why do you think Barack Obama is becoming so popular as a candidate? And he said, well, you know, it's because he's so articulate and he's so clean and he's so well-spoken, right? And he said it as if this might be surprising. The implication being that it might be surprising because he's a Black man in the United States, and that those, according to the views of many white people, are not typical traits of African-American men, right? Now, Joe Biden has a pretty strong record on civil rights in many ways. And obviously, Barack Obama didn't take it overly personally because he made Joe Biden his vice president. But the point is that, you know, when it comes to matters of cultural violence, oftentimes it has to do with things that we don't reflect critically on at all, that just sort of come through us as opposed to coming from us, okay? And so I would argue that Joe Biden's, in this case, what we would call a microaggression, or today we would call a microaggression, it was a slip of the tongue, but it was really more than that. It reflected some deep-seated prejudices and attitudes that even a person who saw himself as not having a racist bone in his body and also as being an advocate for civil rights would say, right? And then come to regret later. So let's talk more specifically now about critical race theory. The principal objection these days politically to CRT seems to be the claim that racism is foundational to the history of the United States and that systemic racism continues to characterize the country in the contemporary period. And this is, I made a point of ordering what is called an ebook from the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, but is really more of a pamphlet that is made thicker by having very big print. But this pamphlet makes it clear that what's being objected to is the idea that the United States may not really be a land of equal opportunity in the way that it claims to be. And in this pamphlet, it says, American culture is based on a timeless understanding of rights rooted in the inherent value and nature of the human race. People of all colors and national backgrounds come here and flourish because our culture embraces common humanity and dignity, okay? And they go on to say that individual choices and decisions have a greater impact on our happiness, well-being, and success than any other factor. And that they really regard in this book, racism and prejudice and bigotry as being aberrational. Yes, of course, there are some racists still, but the vast majority of people in the United States are not racist at all. And to claim so is to really put down the United States as a culture and a society, and to fail to recognize that this is essentially a decent and humane society with opportunity for all. So I think this is, you know, the objections that CRT engender, the sincere objections, we can talk about the more cynical ones later, seem to really focus on this. So what is critical race theory? And rather than go back to giving you some dense texts, there's a pretty good website that I sometimes turn to for my teaching called Global Social Theory. And it talks about critical race theory. It's a British website, hence the spellings that you see. So they say critical race theory refers to a broad social scientific approach to the study of race, racism, and society. Kimberly Crenshaw, whose picture you see on the left, and Derek Bell popularized the notion of critical race theory within the subfield of critical legal studies in the 1980s. Both Crenshaw and Bell made reference to the fact that despite the civil rights legislation in the United States, the social and economic conditions of African Americans had not improved. And through the concept of interest convergence, Bell even claimed that the reason why civil rights legislation passed in the first place was largely because it served the interests of America's white elite. And that is a controversial claim. I think it has some justification if you go back and look at when John Kennedy, as president, finally put forth civil rights legislation. It was at a moment when the South in the United States was becoming ungovernable due to racist violence and the challenging of the violent social structure of the South through nonviolent actions by the civil rights movement. And also it was during the Cold War where the United States was competing for power and influence with the Soviet Union. And one of the Soviet Union's chief ideological tools in its competition with the United States was the maltreatment of US whites' treatment of African Americans and other peoples of color within its boundaries. Now, in their book, Critical Race Theory, an introduction from 2001, Delgado and Stefancic claimed that critical race theory is based around the following premises: that racism actually is ordinary and not aberrational. It's happening all the time in myriad ways in US society. That racism serves some important purposes, which is to say that some people continue to benefit from it, even when the racism that is being practiced doesn't involve overt open bigotry. They also point out that race and races are products of social thought and relations, and that categories that the society invents, manipulates, or retires when convenient. In other words, that these racial categories that we have, as I said before, are socially constructed, right? They're inventions, not biological givens. and they are used for reasons that benefit some members of human populations and not necessarily all. And then there's this notion of intersectionality, right? That no person has a single, easily stated unitary identity, right? And everyone has potentially conflicting, overlapping identities, loyalties, and allegiances, right? So if I look at myself, I look at myself and I am a, white, cis, straight, male, middle class intellectual in the United States, right? And I have sort of multiple identities and multiple interests as I go about living my life, right? And that people's identities, everybody has sort of a multiple identity. And it's interesting to start looking at, well, what is it? Is it the same, for example, to be white and to be a man as it is to be white and to be a woman or a trans person or a non-binary person, et cetera, right? And so this notion of intersectionality is crucial to critical race theory. Another person who is interesting in the critical race theory discussion, who sometimes writes explicitly about it, but other times doesn't use the term at all, is somebody whose book, Racism Without Racists, is one that I use in my class called Race in America. And this is Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who's an Afro-Puerto Rican man born in Pennsylvania, a US citizen all his life. And he says that central to critical race theory is that racism is a lot more than individual prejudice and bigotry. Rather, racism is a systemic feature of social structure. Given that racism is so deeply embedded in social structure, Bonilla Silva argues that racial inequality often gets misrecognized as a natural process rather than as a byproduct of a system of racial domination, what he refers to as a racialized social system. And I want to give you an example that I think you all will be able to relate to of what he's talking about in a couple of minutes. But I do want to go on to say that critical race theory per se, as it is written about by academics, is generally not being taught in K through 12 public schools. And the reason for that is it's incredibly dense. And this is a passage written by a woman named Lani Guinier, who back in the 1990s was nominated by Bill Clinton to be the head of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. And her nomination was derailed precisely because she was talking about things from a critical race theory perspective. And I just want to read you this passage to give you a sense of why it is that it's not typically being taught in public schools, even though it's been outlawed here in Texas, where I live. And just to give a sample paragraph, the goal of interest representation is to desegregate the white majority by minimizing the threshold of representation and the threshold of exclusion for exercising political power. Interest representation rejects winner-take-all majoritarianism in favor of an interest proportionality principle that lowers the threshold for legislative representation from a simple majority and that alters the decisional rule framework from a series of win-lose decisions. Just as one person, one vote cases measure population equality through deviations from the ideal district size, statutory voting rights cases could measure deviations from an ideal proportional power share to determining gross interest representation disparities. Okay, this is an article she was writing about problems with winner-take-all elections in US congressional districts. Okay, this is very dense, highly intellectual stuff that although I suppose it could be watered down to be taught in the public schools, is not being taught per se in the public schools in the United States today. And I think that's something that's important to bear in mind.
So David, is it, what does the word dense mean in the context of what you've just talked about?
Dense as in?
Me?
No, as in difficult to get through and make sense of. A text that is dense means it's packed full of information and concepts, and that you have to really work at to understand, and that you have to have some previous training to understand it fully. Right?
Does that serve and benefit the critics of critical race theory because it's so difficult to?
Well, I think it makes it easier for critical race theory to be misrepresented because in order to understand its history and understand it fully, one would have to have some academic preparation that the intended audience of the criticisms of CRT don't have, right?
When you teach the theory to your students, is that a particularly difficult chore for you to get them to the point?
Well, it takes the better part of a semester oftentimes. And I should also say that I'm not a law professor. So I don't typically go to the works of somebody like Lonnie Guinier to teach it. I'm much more likely to go to the work of somebody like Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who, like me, is a sociologist and is speaking the language of sociologists rather than the language of legal professionals.
Push back? Do they get angry when they grapple with this?
In the past, yes. In the last 5 years or so, I think attitudes among young people are changing a great deal and very quickly. And I think whereas 10 years ago, when Barack Obama was president, for example, I had a hard time sometimes convincing some of my students, my white students, that race was really a big deal still in US society. Since 2016 anyway, the case is a lot easier to make. And I get a lot less pushback from students about it.
So they hold up Barack Obama's presidency as an example of why racism does not exist in the United States?
Or why it's not a problem.
And what's the response to that?
Well, I think there are lots of different kinds of responses, but I think if one goes back and looks, and this might be a good topic for discussion with the congregation, but I think that Barack Obama managed to thread a needle of being obviously considered to be a Black American, right? But he did not have the kind of background and growing up in African-American communities due to the fact that he was had a white mother and a Kenyan father, right? And the fact that he could present himself in a way that was not viewed as being either extreme or threatening to many white voters who might have found a figure like Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton to not be acceptable in the same ways that Barack Obama was. And in fact, Barack Obama did not make dealing with racial injustice a central part of his presidency.
And to quote Biden, he was clean and articulate.
Well, yes. And when Joe Biden said that, it's worth mentioning that Al Sharpton called him up and said to him, you know what, I get up every morning and I take a bath and I put on nice clothes. And I do a lot of public speaking where I think I'm pretty articulate, right? And so he called Joe Biden out on that. And Joe Biden recognized that he had said something that was really not okay, that really was what we would today call a microaggression.
Then there was the attempt with the recordings of Barack Obama's pastor, Jeremiah Wright, in which the effort was made to radicalize Barack Obama because that was suggested by the sermons of his pastor.
Yeah, his pastor, Reverend Wright, was not afraid to talk about the violence and the discrimination against which African-American communities have been struggling ever since really before the founding of the nation. And he did not mince any words about it. And that intense discourse of Reverend Wright was not easy for many white voters in the United States to take. And Barack Obama found it necessary to distance himself from that and to talk about race in ways that would not offend the sensibilities of many white voters.
And that was at Trinity UCC in Chicago.
I believe that's correct.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
To me, David, one of the biggest examples of the racism being systemic and alive and well is, I believe it's historically accurate to say that an intentional political strategy by Ronald Reagan when he first ran was to use a dog whistle to send out a message to the whites about their concerns about blacks and black power and such things.
Yeah, well, that's something that we can talk about. In my classes, I try not to get into partisan politics very much. I don't think that that's my job. I try to give students analytical tools for them to make their own decisions about things. I think that what has happened, and that has made it easier for me to make the case that there is something that we might call systemic racism and systemic discrimination in the United States, even now, and maybe even especially now, has been the move away from dog whistles to openly saying things that just a few years ago would not have been permissible for a lot of people to say in polite company.
Is that the crux of critical race theory? Systemic racism still exists in our society?
Yeah, I would say that that's fair to say.
Because I've got to tell you that I was having coffee with some friends, and one of them said, "So what is critical race theory?"
Mm-hmm.
This is after I had done some preparation for your presentation, and I bumbled around. I didn't have an elevator speech.
Well, part of what goes on is very interesting, right? So I have not typically thought of Eduardo Bonilla Silva, whose book I've been using in my classes for years, as being a critical race theorist per se. And in fact, he doesn't use the term critical race theory anywhere in his most widely read book. And yet, in many ways, it does represent critical race theory, if by critical race theory you mean looking at, in a critical way, the way racial categorization is used in this country, both historically and in the present, to create advantage and disadvantage for people.
David, it's a theory, it's not science. Why isn't it science? Why isn't it?
Well, I think that it's that in social science we can conduct empirical investigation to see whether it is justified to talk about there existing something called systemic racism in the society, and there are things that you can measure. And in fact, that's a nice segue to the question of racial wealth disparities, that I think, even though it isn't, when this was originally getting written about by many people weren't calling it critical race theory, I think remains consistent in general with the principles of critical race theory. And I think this is something that, adult members of a largely middle class congregation will understand, because it has to do with matters of home ownership primarily and managing one's money and wealth. So if it's okay, I'll move on to that and try to just give a quick example that I think people will be able to relate to, that has to do with the structure of US society that produces racial inequalities.
Oh, David, we're at about the 45-minute point.
Mm-hmm.
Rush you or anything. You do what you need to do, because you've been fascinating and interesting. Okay,
well, let me continue, and hopefully we can go through this last little bit quickly and wrap up with this. So there are tremendous racial wealth disparities in the United States, okay? This is information that comes from a book that originally came out in 1995 called Black Wealth, White Wealth by Melvin Oliver and Thomas Shapiro. And in their book, they talk about the differences between wealth and income, wealth being an accumulation of money and resources, income being a flow of money coming into a family or coming to an individual. They examine a lot of data on wealth and income differences between African Americans and white European Americans. And they talk about something that's important, the racialization of state policy, how specifically racist policies in the past get sedimented, the consequences of those policies get sedimented into the structure of the United States and produce ongoing racial inequality, especially with regards to wealth. And this occurs in large measure through the intergenerational transmission of wealth, which is to say, inheritance. And in their book, they talk about a lot of things that happened in the past that have consequences in the present. So for example, there was Sherman's Order 15 during the Civil War. The Union's General Sherman confiscated Southern plantations and redistributed them to Black soldiers, Black Union soldiers. After the Civil War concluded, this order was rescinded and Blacks who had undertaken cultivation of these lands were forced off of them. You had the Southern Homestead Act of 1866. In principle, this act was supposed to open up designated homesteading lands to Blacks as well as whites. In practice, much of the lands designated for homesteading were poor, and systematic discrimination practiced by the authorities in implementing the law in the South worked against land distribution to former slaves, so that most of the recipients of Southern homestead lands were whites. This meant that 75% of Southern Black farmers at the turn of the century were tenants of lands owned by whites instead of owners of their own lands and their own farms.
That's a fact. That's a fact. That's not theory.
That's a fact, and it's not theory. Now, there were some things that were done by the Roosevelt administration during the New Deal that benefited millions of people in the United States to keep them from getting evicted from their homes. One was the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So during the Great Depression, the Roosevelt administration created this entity to refinance thousands of mortgages in danger of default or foreclosure. Key to this process was the institution of a formal and uniform system of appraisal of property values. One of the factors that appraisers were systematically trained to take into account when determining the value and useful productive life of housing was the racial composition or potential racial composition of the community. Black and mixed race communities were given a lower rating, thus creating disincentives for the HOLC to refinance mortgages in those areas. Now, in other words, there was something systematically built into this measure of the New Deal that made it much less likely for African Americans to be the beneficiaries of the policy than whites. Also, the Federal Housing Authority, established back in 1934, the FHA's purpose was to promote home ownership and construction of new homes to stimulate the economy. It put into effect the modern mortgage system that enabled people to buy homes on small down payments and at reasonable interest rates with lengthy repayment periods and full loan amortization. There were systematic biases in the FHA lending procedures that favored the construction and purchase of new single-family homes over the rehabilitation and purchase of multifamily homes. The underwriter's manual for the FHA included explicit instructions to appraise homes in all white areas at a higher rate than in Black or mixed race areas, thus making it more likely for whites to receive loans than Blacks and for new home construction to be financed in all white suburban areas, which often had explicit covenants barring Black residents, right? And this meant that after the war, the equation of inner city with African American and suburbs with white became part of the sort of social reality of the United States. The other thing that was not necessarily explicitly racial or intended to be was that agricultural and domestic workers were originally excluded from the Social Security system. This at the insistence of Southern legislators. Right? Most of the agricultural and domestic workers in the South were African Americans at that time. Things that are going on in the contemporary period, it says 1991 here, but it continues on. More recent studies have been done of this, that civil rights legislation has not been adequately enforced. So for example, studies have been conducted by the Federal Reserve of home mortgage applications, and these showed that commercial banks reject mortgage applications from Blacks at twice as often as those by whites. According to the study, there was no legitimate, or these studies, I should say, because others have been done since, there was no legitimate financial reason for the rejection of Black applications in most cases. In fact, high-income Blacks living in affluent areas had their loan applications rejected at a far higher rate than low-income whites. And then there's the Internal Revenue Code. There are lots of tax breaks in the tax code that are asset-based. And because Blacks hold far fewer assets than whites, they are systematically less benefited by these breaks. Two main examples of these are the lower rate at which income from capital gains is taxed and the ability to deduct from one's taxable income the amount of interest and tax paid on a home, right? If you're less likely to own a home and you are less likely to have a home that has a high appraised value, your benefit of these tax code, these elements of the tax code is far less than if you have a bigger, higher priced, more valuable home. We might also look at the phasing out of the estate tax. If you are less likely to have an estate to pass on to your children that is substantial, if you are African American or Mexican American, than if you are a white European American, that may mean that the principal beneficiaries of a repeal of the estate tax would be white rather than people of color. The other thing is that white European Americans have some significant wealth advantages precisely because of residential segregation, right? Property values in Black areas historically and at present appreciate less or actually depreciate relative to values in white areas. Property values in largely white areas are higher because they are in white areas, right? And whites may flee a racially mixed area, not out of personal prejudice, but out of rational economic calculations. They realize that if they want their home to appreciate in value, it may be a problem if the neighborhood becomes increasingly racially mixed over time. Why is this? Whites are the majority of home buyers, and white preferences overwhelmingly determine the prices of homes in different areas. These arguments come from the sociologist Dalton Conley's 2001 book, Being Black, Living in the Red. And we can see today that sedimented into the structure of US society is that wealth differences on average between white families and Black and Hispanic families are much, much larger than our income differences, and that the gap has been growing over time, so that the average white family's net worth is 7 times greater than the average Black family's net worth, and 5 times greater than the average Hispanic family's net worth. And a lot of this has to do precisely with home ownership, right? There have been lots of barriers to home ownership that have been faced and that Black and Hispanic Americans continue to face at present that make their rates of home ownership much lower and that make the value of the homes that they do own on average to be much lower than white families, okay? And most people, even today with the stock market boom we've been having, et cetera, have most of their wealth held in their homes. And so what we see is this is a way in which, without necessarily there being overt bigotry involved, right, very disparate outcomes have been created through government policies over the years that have a racial dimension that is often not taken into account. And I think that this is a good example of thinking about race critically, right? Is this all happening just because of random preferences that people have, or is there something more systematic that's going on? And with that, that's really the end of my presentation. And I will stop sharing my screen. Try to get to that, stopping my share, putting us all back together. And if you have any questions or comments to wrap up, that would be great.
You know, one of the things that I heard once in a talk was, stand up if you, as a white person, would be willing to switch places with a Black person. And the speaker was highlighting the fact that even people who felt like there is no difference were unwilling to stand up because they realized there's a difference. You know, it's harder to get a house, and it's harder to get a break, and it's harder to, and so it was amazing to experience that. People that said there is nothing wrong now. Yes, we have a bad history, but currently everything's fine, but they still wouldn't stand up.
Well, and this is, you know, who was it, Faulkner, that said, you know, history isn't dead, it's not even past, something to that effect. I think I may be mangling the words of a Nobel Prize winning author there, but you get the point, rather, that things that have happened in the past continue to haunt us in the present. And this is one of the great questions then. What is to be done, right? Is it enough to not be a bigot if you're a white person? Or are there some systematic changes that involve government policies, et cetera, that would be really required to remedy the inequalities that have been produced over the course of over a century, a couple of centuries?
So that's the question about, are you anti-racist, you know, intentionally focused on ridding ourselves of racism, or
because it's
quietly
easy,
not racist?
Right, exactly. And it's easy to go along. We all have lots of things going on in our lives. I'm speaking again as a straight, white, male, cis, you know, middle-class person with a secure income that owns my own house, et cetera. I have lots and lots of things going on in my life that keep me really busy and preoccupied with what's going on in my own life, in spite of the fact that I'm a sociologist and then I teach about these things, et cetera, right? It's real easy to just go along and not take any.
One of my observations as a person trained in the law is that critical race theory is nothing new. This is about disparate treatment that is not necessarily intentionally racist, as we've said many times here this morning. And there have been efforts through lawsuits, which is not the most efficient way to get these things done, to try to curb it. What we see now, to me, is weaponizing critical race theory as something that will inspire folks on the right wing side of Americana to be more worried and scared and feared because their white privilege could go away. And this is tremendously challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Real quickly, remember the class action suit brought against the Department of Agriculture by Black farmers? And those allegations dated back to some of the various programs that you were describing, David.
Right.
And that was successful, apparently, in that the federal government's going to write a big check to a bunch of farmers. Maybe they're still fighting it. But you can see how lawsuits and the law don't get it done in a way that should happen.
Well, and I think one of the things is there's always the question of enforcement capacity, and political willingness to enforce the law. And it varies from administration to administration, both, you know, at the state, local, and federal levels. Yeah. And I think that I was just thinking about this yesterday when I was hearing about President Biden's vaccine mandate. And it was Marty Walsh, the Secretary of Labor, was being interviewed on the radio. And the reporter was asking him, can you really enforce this? Do you have the capacity to go out and really make sure that vaccine mandates and or testing are being carried out in every business in the United States with 100 or more employees? And the labor secretary said what he had to say, which is, oh, of course. Right? But the question of willingness to enforce the law and capacity to enforce the law are big issues always in this. And it's interesting, for example, that a famous labor market economist, at this point in my life, I'm getting bad with names. I think it's Rebecca Blank, but I may be getting her name wrong. But one of the things that she found in her research is that if you think about return to human capital, where do you get the most bang for your buck in terms of your educational credentials and experience if you are an African-American employee? And she found, unsurprisingly, that the federal government was one of the places where you got the biggest bang for your buck. And part of the reason for that, presumably, is that within the government is where civil rights laws are most likely to be vigorously enforced. And there's the capacity to do it, much more so than in the hundreds of thousands of private businesses around the country.
And then there's the United States military, where the order went out from your commander, there shall not be any racism within our ranks. And that sounded pretty good. That was during the President Truman's administration. Right. And all of those overt things maybe were gotten rid of, or that was substantially better. But minority soldiers still grumble today about their treatment.
And yet the most integrated institution, racially speaking, in the United States is the military. And the least racially segregated metropolitan area in the United States, at least last time I checked, was Norfolk, Virginia Beach. Precisely because there are huge military bases there and lots of civilian military employees. And it's in the South.
Indeed.
And what do they say? The most segregated hour in the week is a church, right?
Right. That too.
Wow.
Well, hopefully I've given you all some things to think about. And my understanding, Kevin, is that you're going to, at the beginning of the broadcast of this recording, raise some questions, or at the end of the broadcast of this recording, raise some questions for the congregation to discuss and be thinking about. And then when I'll come back live, not in person, but via live feed on November 21st, hopefully there'll be lots of other things people want to talk about. There's so much more we could talk about with regard to this topic. I just tried to put out a few basic things and gave the example of wealth disparities precisely.
Yes, I think this is a great foundation.
That
and I know for myself,
it's something that a lot of people as adults have experienced with. My poor students tend to kind of glaze over with this discussion about home ownership and all that because they're too young, most of them, to have had any experience with going out and buying a home or thinking about it, et cetera. And their parents did it before they were born, or if they did it while they moved, while they were growing up, they weren't really involved in the decision-making or were too young to really understand what was going on.
David,
this is where the rubber meets the road in a lot of ways.
You bet. I appreciate your time and the benefit and value of your expertise and experience. Even if you are my nephew, you are terrific and very helpful. And what I want to challenge our audience, a couple of things, and even you, David, what is going to be, if it's possible, the short form description that I can use over coffee about what critical race theory is. And then I would like, please, to have some pushback when misleading stuff is advanced by people in response. So we'll look forward to that discussion next time, as well as some tips from you, Professor Spener, to help us with those two things, or at least me. So stay tuned, everybody, and thank you with us.
Well, thank you so much. You all take care until then, and I'll see you in a few weeks.
Thank you.
Take care. I'm stopping the recording now.